And I was as a researcher, I was kind of fiddling around the edges, and I've had wonderful opportunities to do small scale innovations. This image is a picture of a room. The next three pictures are a series of ideas that are linked, and I'm going to pull out two ideas that we learned from this. In 2018, we took out all the regular rectangular furniture in a 30-person seminar room. It was a new space, and it wasn't encouraging the types of learning activity that we value. So we thought, well, if we change the furniture, what will happen? We learned two really important things. The first was the value of empty space. In this room, we created a perimeter where the students could actually access those whiteboards around the edge. So that was the first thing. It's not always what you put into a space. It's the empty space into which humans can move. That is often the lifeblood of convivial learning activity. The second thing we learned in this particular room, so if we think of floor plate and furnishings, there was this very strong U shape in the furnishings that we put in there. And that helped to create a very, very strong, when people gathered, there was a very strong shared visual orientation to what was going on. And it was a space into which the lecturer would move. We have these big clunky lecterns that are stuck in the corner. Suddenly the lecturer was coming out from behind the lectern, and whoever was talking would take that, there's the space at the top of that U. So that was very profound. So we thought, well, this is wonderful, let's scale it up. You know, if it works for 30, how does it work for 60? The thing we learned in scaling it up, so a room next door, double the floor space, double the people, one teacher, 60 students, two of those U shapes. By putting two of those very, very strong U shapes in, we had bifurcated the attention of the learners, and that created quite a demanding tension for a single educator to navigate. Suddenly we had two U's, and they didn't really know where to stand. They had to work really hard at holding it all together. So there was the strong U didn't create the shared focal point anymore. And interestingly, on a bigger floor plate, the furnishings, I had always been staggered at how little maintenance the first room took. Things just stayed where they should. In this room, it was like Brownian movement. All the furnishings just drifted towards it. It was impossible to keep anything. It was impossible to maintain a semblance of order in that space. Everything just seemed to move out, which had two problems. First, as people came through the room on regular intervals, who was tidying up and resetting? And when people needed to use that very valuable perimeter, the furnishings had all kind of clumped up against the walls. They seemed to like keep going until they hit the walls. So what we did in the next iteration of this room was we thought, well, we value the alternating focus of internal group and together, and we like having flexible furnishings, but we need some way of controlling that Brownian movement of furniture. So in this particular space, which is now, it's a new space that holds 221 students in a similar sort of setting, and can be divided into three sections or run as one continuous space. It's hard to see from this image, but there's a central spine running down it. So as it's an access spine, so someone in a wheelchair could make their way through. That spine has edges, and in each of the curves, there's a dedicated floor plate that the boundaries of which hold the furniture in place. So you can reconfigure things, but you haven't got this very strong, you've got some inclination, so you can see across the room, and you've got these little pockets where the activity happens. It was scheduled to open in 2020. It kind of sort of did, but real learning activity only started happening in it the week before the second lockdown. So this is one example of a lovely set of, it's medical, this is a room in our Westmead campus, so it's medical education. This was a wonderful use of it. But so everything came to a standstill. So not only did the small scale iterative intervention around the sides come to a stop, but everything closed and everything went online. And we had this, there was this initial moment where in Sydney, certainly we'd had fires, we had had floods, and now we had a pandemic and everybody's quite stressed and at home teaching online. The first reaction was, why do we need a campus anyway? It's never going to be normal. Can't we just be online? Why do we need a campus? So that was the first response. It'll never be the same again. But quite quickly, so that worried me as someone who values shared time and spent learning. That was quite quickly replaced with this very visceral sense of longing for shared time and shared space and being together. And as that became more dominant, we spent some time at Sydney redefining what we value in learning. Essentially, we redefined our teaching philosophy. We came down to quite a short, succinct statement, which ultimately boiled down to we value learning through an alternating pattern of expert-led instruction and student-led inquiry-based learning. So if that's what we value, then we need to orient. So the questions came then, if that's what we value, how do we accommodate that space, that type of learning activity? And in a lot of the work that I do, I work with audiovisual people, and I had this moment in a meeting with them where I found that they were trying to draw representations of what I was saying and asking me, so they would draw a representation and they'd come say, this is what we're trying to support. And I'd go, no, that's not our learning model. So I suddenly thought, we don't have pictures from a learning model. So that was my first response, was to sit with people and come up with visual representation. So what does that alternating pattern look like? Knowledge sharing, knowledge construction, and knowledge creation. So knowledge sharing is sharing of information. That's sharing of information, at a sort of introductory level as opposed to a deeply reflective level. The knowledge construction is about making ideas meaningful and the students making ideas meaningful in their own context. And the co-creation or co-creation is about student development of new ideas through communities of practice. So there's 3 sets of ideas there. And then the construction and co-creation without the facilitator. So in the first 3, you can see the facilitators present. In the second 2, you can see there's no facilitator. And in all my discussions with people, I wanted to make sure that we were paying attention to the students aren't disembodied humans. We need to be paying attention to aspects of community. If we're talking about a campus-wide student-centered approach, how are we making space for community and care? And that was the initial set that went out to consultation with the faculties. There was one exception that after the process of going to the faculties, there was one that was one addition. We wanted a set that was as few as possible, as many as necessary. And in terms of science, music, and medicine, there was a sense in which we need spaces to support facilitated knowledge construction or skill development with an expert, one-on-one. And that has tools, it has implications for the type of tools they have access to and access to certain types of space. So we decided that it was sufficiently different that it needed to be represented. Once we had this set of valued forms of human interaction that we were trying to accommodate, we could start visualizing this over time. So instead of being tied to a lecture in a lecture room, giving a lecture, which is different in medicine, veg science, across them, we'd say, okay, so what would your students be doing in a single session? And we could visualize they're going to be doing 3 things. They're not just going to be doing 1 thing. We could say, okay, at the beginning, mid-semester, a week for these students over the whole, this student in this unit of study over a whole week in the semester, what does it look like? What kind of spaces do they need to have access to? And equally, we could then say, and it looks different at the end of semester. Okay, once we had these kind of an ability to have discussions, meaningful discussions, anchored in shared reality, we could then start talking about the learning spaces. You're going to be asking, we're talking about activity and time, where the spaces. Once we got to the point where we had visual representations that would take us through that progression, we could then start saying, okay, for this type of learning activity, is it going to be synchronous or asynchronous? Again, all the visualizations that I've worked on have the thing that we're not talking about that needs to be kind of kept in our peripheral vision. In this instance, it's the asynchronous learning. If we're thinking about synchronous learning, there's 4 ways it could happen. And in these pictures, green is in person and blue is online. And what I want to point out to here, I'll share the link, you can find the slides later if you want to come back and look in any detail. But the important thing is these bubbles of what's not in the picture for me. So we all are pretty clear about what we have to have. We don't often focus on what's not there. So When we're in person, what are the online needs? When we're online, what are the in-person needs? And these are going to be very real for us as we move into a different ways of thinking about learning space. But our biggest challenge at Sydney is that those pictures that I showed you at the beginning, they are very few and far between. Our reality is this. Now we want to we've spent the time over the last 12 months. In the beginning, nobody wanted to talk about learning space. Now all anybody wants to talk about is learning space. And now we know what we want, and this is what we've got. So how do we go from here to where we want to be? And this is a set of principles that I developed prior to the pandemic, which I had great difficulty talking to anybody about for the last 2 years. You can come back to these, but the first 3 are taken care of by the visualizations now. The fourth is about our commitment to designing a sufficient variability in our portfolio of spaces to accommodate the range of learning activity that we value, but that it's anchored around real people, so real teachers and real learners, not the heroes amongst us. So the sustainable is environmental and human and capacities. We're making a very strong commitment to drawing on local knowledge. That serial innovation that I was doing around the edges is now going to become the norm. And in terms of thinking about sustainable practices, I talked about how we wanted to constrain the set of possible spaces that we have from both a space management and a teaching and learning practices. In terms of teachers, they need to be able to book into an active learning space, and it needs to have a set of affordances that support them to do that. On the other side of that, we can't only have endless standardization. So principle 6 is about allowing space for meaningful co-creation and local variation. And we have not got anywhere near to this yet, but it's the direction of travel that we want to go. So within our constrained set of space types, how do we make space for meaningful co-creation? How do we support local variation? Some people might want to be doing object-based learning. Some people need to have space for a text. Some people need a horse. Some people need an I-beam. How do we accommodate those local variations within that sort of constrained set of space types? And the very last thing, which lives in my mind, having been the researcher trying to corral all those pieces of furniture that just kept exploding out around the room, is if we are going to design and maintain and manage active learning spaces, we have to prioritize the curation and care of space for learning. Given the limited resources that we have to think of innovative ways to do that and to share that responsibility with our students. So that's a little bit of insight into where we've been, some of the questions we've had to come up with reasonable answers for in the last 2 years, and where we hope to be going. And I trust that in sharing just a little portion of our journey, that might have sparked ideas for you, and that in the groups that you're going to go into now, that will inspire you to share little bits of your stories with each other, because I think that in the sharing of stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, not just the shiny, beautiful. I think in learning spaces, we have an inclination to only show our best. And whilst best is great, and we absolutely ought to be aspiring to creating rich, varied, convivial spaces for learning, the reality for most of us is that we work in constrained environments, and we need to find creative ways to do that, and to do that kindly as well. So thank you for your time, and with that, I'm going to hand back to Jenny and or Lucilla.
Thank you, Pippa. Great presentation.
Sorry, I'm stopped hearing.
Do we have any questions for Pippa? I think you can put your mics on if you want to ask a question, because you don't have too many people. I have a question. I think that was a great presentation. I think there are so many points that I can see connections in terms of my own experience at Master University and what happened, like how you're going in one direction and suddenly, as the COVID comes, it just shifts all around and makes people, ourselves question, like what is it that we are doing and how we are doing and how can we continue to do what we thought that we were doing in the new kind of setup, right? But one of the things that I was wondering if you could make a comment about, because many of the people that are part of the SIG are interested in the school context. How do you see your principles, right, crossing over within the school context?
I think that if one boils it down to how humans learn, I did my original ethnography in a school and I ended up doing learning spaces in a university. I try it's about the context in which the learners are based and who they are. If we're doing knowledge sharing with 5-year-olds, we need to understand the requirements of the 5-year-olds or the 12-year-olds, but it's still knowledge sharing. And if our commitment is to share knowledge or to create knowledge with humans, whether they're big or small, the variation comes in how you accommodate for those differences, not in that we're not doing knowledge sharing. So I think that I was looking for a set of visualizations that would work across disciplines. And I would argue that with accommodations to age and size and what's developmentally appropriate, I think that that's those representations, if one's taking an inquiry-based, if one values and is working towards an inquiry-based model, I think they work as well. I think that if you're not doing inquiry-based learning, then your philosophy needs to be so clearly articulated that it's easier for you, enough for you to find a visual representation to have these discussions. Because I can't tell you, I spent so long with my 7 principles trying to get people to engage with me. Nobody was interested. As soon as I bring out the images, everybody's happy, everybody wants to have a talk, and I can talk to audiovisual engineers, I can talk to architects, I can talk to people in chemistry, I can talk to the lawyers.
A common language, right? That brings everybody together to the conversation in a way.
Kia ora, my name's Annette Thompson. I'm from Christchurch in New Zealand. I'm really interested, I'm a drama teacher and doing a thesis at the moment on drama teachers in their new build spaces. So I was really interested to hear you talking about empty space, because drama teachers work in an empty space quite often. And so, yeah, just want to hear more a little bit about what the empty space around the U shape gave to the learning.
If there was like a magic sauce in that space, it was the empty space, which sounds like if you go to people and you say, well, what you must design this, what must we put in? I'm like, no, what must you leave out? I think there's a principle, and Christopher Alexander is a mathematician and architect, and he talks about the value of positive space. And it's about placing things with as much attention on what remains. So if I place this glass, I need to think about where I put it, not only about where it is, but how it creates the space around it, what's left behind. And that's what we inadvertently managed to do with that U shape. We had no idea what would happen. I have a list of about 26 different forms of human interaction that were taking place. I'd spend from 9 in the morning till 7 at night, every Tuesday over an entire semester in that room. So I saw the coming and going and the different people and the different everything. And the rich variety of what those people that came in had known, they just were scheduled in there, they pitched up, there's the research of this funny space, what do I do? Over time, what was happening in that empty space was far more interesting than anything else that was happening in that room. And that's why I am so convinced that that's a really important part. And it's not just, I had accountants, historians, economists, engineers, marketing people, French people, and they were all using that space. And none of them had prepared their lesson to use that. And the student, I even had at the end, somebody did a visualization kind of meditation thing. And I watched in 2 different spaces, same teacher, 2 different spaces in that room. The students lay on the floor and completely, nobody asked. They the lecturer closed the blinds and the students lay on the floor. I've never seen that. Nobody told them to, they just did.
Any more questions to people?
I have got another one if no one else has anything.
Go ahead.
The other thing I was really interested in that you're saying about the teacher coming from behind the lectern in that U shape. And so, yeah, just hearing more about what do you think it was the space that prompted them to do that? Like, so in drama, we work predominantly in circles, and the teacher is usually amongst that circle in some form, either standing all together or sitting all together. And so they're very much a part of the learning and not in that power position near the front of the classroom, so-called front of the classroom. So yeah, I'm just really interested in whether you think it was the shape or what was it that made them come out from behind?
Orientation. So it was the furniture placed people's bodies in a way that everybody's eyes were oriented towards the apex of that shape. Mm-hmm. So to move into the presentation space, you had to leave your enormous ship in the corner where you were driving things from, come out from behind the screen, or else all you were going to do is, people tended not to use the PowerPoint, and they tended to walk into, even the reluctant accountants would come in to that presentation space, and in a single glance, they had they could make eye contact with everyone. The students were even commenting on being able to learn people's names quicker. They have name tags, and they could, just because they were sitting oriented towards each other. So there's a paper I can share. I have got the slides, I can share them. There's a paper on it if you're interested in what we found. It was a fascinating experiment, and it's unfortunately has evolved into something else, and I keep going, we mustn't forget that was really good. We need to make sure we have some of those somewhere.
Thank you so much.
The other thing was that leaving it meant that the students had to take over. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm really interested in higher education and classroom both, but how did the changes that you made, did they lead to other changes? Because I mean, the learning space is one aspect of the whole ecology. So often when you change one aspect, the other structures, and universities have so many structures that you've got to work within, was the sort of pressure to change those, like how long classes were, the length of class, or where they're timetabled, or and you've got the hybrid sort of thing, the online, the face-to-face, all of those sorts of structures.
A very, very kind of gnarly problem. And as I said in the beginning, when I was playing in those spaces, it was Pippa playing around at the edges in one space. Yes, people were randomly timetabled into there and they just had to get on with it. I thought I was going to have a lot of resistance. I had more resistance in the bigger space than the smaller space. So I couldn't control who was in there, and I had to deal with the grumpy people who were in there if they didn't like what was there. Now we have a commitment to a very, as high as you can go to that commitment to the alternating pattern. So now we've gone through the process of articulating our teaching philosophy, really. It's down to a small paragraph. It's been through Senate and we've committed to it. We now need to find ways to do that with timetabling. So providing the spaces, timetabling the spaces, and it's a 10-year journey. It's no one's pretending it's a quick thing. It requires attention at every level. It also requires a huge amount of support in terms of learning, instructional design, redesign. But we think the pandemic has made us rethink everything. From this morning, we were in a university-wide assessment redevelopment forum. One of the biggest problems that we've had in learning space redesign is that everything innovative, the person who's in charge of exams comes in and says, I need to be able to put them in straight lines, and they need to not be cheating, and they need to not be doing this, and that lovely space with all that curvy stuff is giving me the heebie-jeebies, make it all like straight. And we've now got to a commitment where in future redesign will not be constrained by past examination practices at the highest level, but you need that at the highest level in order to stop that happening and in order to start the move to somewhere else. So it's a kind of balancing act, moving forward as you do it, and it's not easy, but having that very strong commitment from the top is going to make things so much easier, because now there's no debate. And we've played with high flex where we have groups that are mixed throughout the pandemic. That is parked. That is for the heroes who need to do it because of environmental constraints, and mostly that's in medicine across distributed campuses. It's not going to be a model that we try and, we can do parallel groups, all online or all in person, but we're not going to try and do the mixed groups.
Thank you very much, Pippa. That was fascinating. It's given me so much food for thought. I would love to be able to have a look at your slides again, just to consider the diagrams, especially the images, and yeah.